in this. I'm being straight up with you. It comes from a meeting in my parents' family room where I just stopped by today to pick up the mail with Dad's childhood buddy, who Susan will certainly know, was known as a child known as Martin Bauer. His name today is Yehuda Bauer. He is the most famous Holocaust historian around. He and Dad and two others went to English language school at the age of 10 in Prague and mastered the English language. It ended up being useful for 3 out of the 4. One of the 4 was killed. My father survived concentration camp. One went to England and used English there, and one became the world's leading Holocaust historian and professor emeritus at Hebrew University and used his English frequently. But we were meeting socially one day in my parents' house. He would come every couple of years to give a lecture, and I would be there. And he asked me, I couldn't have been maybe 28, 29 years old, what was it like to be a doctor? And I said, well, I think it's been a pretty good choice, career choice. I think people really try to do the right thing. And he says, oh, I think you're being quite optimistic because doctors have tremendous power to kill people and to render great harm, and they have done it. And I said, oh, really? And why do you, that wouldn't be my experience. You know, ever since I always tell you guys have some skepticism about your experience. It's always limited. He said, well, you need to read. And I did. About 10 years later, I was asked by somebody in second generation when I was president and then chairman of the LA Holocaust Museum to give this lecture. And I was not happy because the last thing an academic wants to do is prepare another lecture. But I did it, and I've used it ever since. And so the genesis of this is what became accepted history of medical work during the Nazi regime. The history is not old. The history came to light in the 1990s. Elements of it were known immediately after the war, and it was fleshed out in the 90s, and it continues to be an important topic of historical research. And some of the things that I will propose are theories, and other ones I will try to present to you are facts on the experience of the medical profession with eugenics and the medicalization of racial policy in the Third Reich. You know, when Reform Judaism began, when America began at the end of the 18th century, there was still a strong religious belief that was kind of axiomatic throughout Western civilization. And that religious belief, whether practiced or not, was that all men are created equal and all are created in the image of God. By the 19th century, religion was in its decline, a decline that obviously continues today. And in its place, many philosophical and ideological movements began, some of which you are old enough to know: Marxism, socialism, fascism. These were movements that had their origin in the 19th century when, devoid of a common religious heritage, other kinds of ideologies developed. And come the middle of the 19th century, concepts of ethnic and racial superiority were proposed in direct repudiation of the concept that all people are created equal, Enlightenment philosophy. By 1855, you see the first book on the inequality of human races that was published in French. This preceded by 4 years Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. Now, Charles Darwin had really not much interest in social anthropology of human beings. He was trying to describe how animals and plants evolve under selection pressure over centuries or millennia. And that was his theory, not completely proven even to this day, but widely accepted for good reason, and published in 1859. He, again, made no implications about how this affected human populations. However, it rapidly was adopted by those who were looking for some explanation as to why society builds itself the way it does, constitutes itself the way it does, and evolves in some way as it does. Uh, this was, again, the era of intense struggle and strife over what human beings are. And there were two competing theories that were used in a way to inform Darwin's observation of the evolution of species under selection pressure. The first and the older one was Lamarck's theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarck proposed that as one acquires characteristics, they are inscribed on something called genes, whatever those were. They were not known until the 1950s what they were, but something called genes, and they could be passed on to further generations. If I decide to be a weightlifter and I go up to 250 pounds and I'm all muscle, Lamarck would propose that my children would inherit the same muscular physique. This is not true, of course, but we're going to talk about that in a moment. Opposing that was a theory of inheritance proposed by a monk named Mendel, who published in the very poorly read Brno Medical Journal. Brno is the capital of Moravia. It's about an hour and a half from Vienna. In those days, it had at least 30 or 40% of the people were German speaking, and the name of the town was Brünn. After World War II, they were all kicked out by the Czechoslovak government, and you don't hear too much German there now, but his publications were all in German. And he proposed that actually one inherits physical characteristics not on the basis of the environment, but on the basis of firmly inscribed elements in this thing called the gene. Two white roses will have offspring that are white roses, and two red roses will have a red rose, and a red rose and a white rose will give rise to a red rose because the red is the dominant pigment. His material was hidden for many, many years because he published in such an obscure place. People actually used to accuse me of that. They used to say, Gary, you just publish in the place that is easier to get your manuscript accepted. You need to try a little harder. And I used to say, I don't want these lousy editors or reviewers tearing apart my stuff. I'm just going to publish wherever they're going to take it. And so that was my philosophy toward academics. Somehow it worked, but it's generally not a good philosophy. Everybody thought that the nature-nurture debate was solved with Weissmann's experiment of somatic versus germ cell development, in which he proposed that cutting the tail off of a rodent for 100 generations would not alter the 101st generation that would still make a tail. In other words, there was nothing you could do for an individual that would be passed on in the genes. Today, in 2021, we actually know that these two theories, Mark and Mendel, they're actually both operative. A child can inherit a mother's anxiety disorder from trauma through maternal DNA. But for the most part, our eye color is related to fixed things in the genome. And you can't really alter the genome of the future generations unless you alter the cells in the testis and the cells in the ovary. Otherwise, you're not going to pass on most characteristics. But this nature-nurture debate and this different way of thinking about characteristics informed politics. Because again, the ferment was there. Lamarckian inheritance, in which you acquire characteristics that you pass on to your descendants, quickly became associated with ideologies of the left. Marxism, socialism, they were felt to be egalitarian, that nobody, for example, here to use the most flagrant one that would get you into a lot of trouble today, nobody is inherently homosexual. They decide to do so. It's not in their genes. Okay, we might disagree with that today, But that was the view of communists, that everything was modifiable, that nothing was inscribed in your genome. On the other hand, Mendelian inheritance became the foundation of National Socialism and fascism, that said that everything is in your genes and nothing you do is passed on to subsequent generations. That's only good for you. And they called this, outside of National Socialism, something called social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism in the late 19th century was used by many to explain why the world in the West changed so radically in the Industrial Revolution. Think about it for a moment. If you were in United States, or maybe better, in Europe in 1860, you would see around you individuals who had suddenly become wealthy and successful based on entrepreneurialism. And you would think to your grandparents' generation, where nobody who was bourgeois could come out of material things. Basically, people were wealthy because they inherited titles and they were part of families that were genetically, if you will, predisposed to lead a country. And all of a sudden in the 19th century, you see actually who were the leaders? They were rich folks who got rich with various mercantile ideas, or railroads, or steel, or later petroleum. Many of these people who rose to the top of the industrial world sought to explain why they became so wealthy, famously wealthy. And some of them said, well, basically in free market capitalism, we've got the genes to succeed. And the ones that are sitting in the street and begging for money, they don't have the genes to succeed. Now, some very famous capitalists disagreed with this. Andrew Carnegie, he actually said, it has nothing to do with genes, it has to do with the freedom of the environment that we can take advantage if we're given a push to achieve. And that's why he left all of his money to philanthropy. But he was in a minority. Most of the other great free market capitalists sought to explain their success by something that they believed was inborn to them. And it wasn't a long step from there to come up with the idea that maybe you could make the entire country full of people who are successful free market capitalists if you would breed them better. And if you would worry about the racial hygiene, the racial health of your people. And believe it or not, by 1895, this became scientific orthodoxy. A book was published in German by a man named Plötz, who wrote several propositions, contentions. One, social policies that take care of the sick and the poor allow weak elements in the society to prosper and procreate. That there is an inherent contradiction between charity, between the Karsh Center and natural selection, which would select for a better folk. Originally, this was an apolitical movement, but very rapidly, as I said before, this was championed by the industrial class who sought to explain why, when they left the farms and they left the feudal society, did some people rise to the top and other people dropped to such a bottom that had never been even known in feudal society. And we have that bottom now. And believe me, it must be far lower than what happened in an agrarian, medieval kind of world where at least there were families and there were villages. This racial hygiene idea that people succeeded because they were genetically endowed to succeed became scientific orthodoxy. It was not only scientific orthodoxy in the German medical establishment, it was scientific orthodoxy throughout the Western world. As a matter of fact, if we were in a class, Olive, we should be one day back together in real life, I would in a Socratic way, pick on you and ask you, where was the first place where the government chose to sterilize people that it didn't want to procreate? And the answer was the United States of America. Something like 20 or 22 states in the Union had mandatory sterilization that was supported by the Supreme Court of the United States. The famous Oliver Wendell Holmes line was, 4 generations of criminality and imbecility are enough for the state. Iowa was the first place that had sterilization, 1907, long before there was a Nazi party. Now, such a thing didn't exist even in Europe. So America was actually Hitler's model. But most journals on racial hygiene were in German. Now, part of that might have been because the lingua franca of medicine and science was German. No American doctor who came from a well-to-do family failed to do a rotation in Vienna, which had the greatest hospital in the world. Most of the pathology today, the names that we call things, the eponyms, come from Viennese doctors. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in their youth were sent to study there for a semester. That's probably why they left Vienna so much alone after World War II, whereas the whole of Germany was heavily divided. Vienna was divided into 4 pieces, but it was pretty soft. Unlike what you learn from the Third Man, within a few years they were gone. But German was the language of science and the language of medicine. So it's not surprising that most journals on racial hygiene were in German. It also became a governmental concern. Again, building on what was being done in the United States. And by the way, California, I think, did more mandatory sterilizations than any other state in the Union. Even the democratic or sickly democratic Weimar Republic, as early as 1920, had a council for racial hygiene. So it was not a purely German phenomenon, but it was one that was ripe for exploitation because the National Socialists already had believed that human behavior was not modifiable, human behavior was genetically endowed. Now, was racial hygiene itself, the idea that we are what our genes are, was that inherently racist? Well, not necessarily. One of the funniest papers by this guy, Muckerman, at the bottom, questioned whether the Aryans or Nordics were really superior. He wrote, kind of rhetorically, what great music and what great art has ever come out of Scandinavia? You could think of Mucha and you could think of Grieg, and otherwise you draw a blank. All the great works of Western civilization come from the South, from Italy, where there are all sorts of racial mongrels that have been intermarrying since, the time of the Greeks. But that was an isolated paper. The majority said that actually hybrid vigor did not apply to humans, that actually it was crime, infection, cancer, and mental illness that was brought upon the German people because there was no policy of who should breed with whom. And of course, that was the beginning of the end. Eugenics had been proposed long before National Socialists. And again, it was popular in the United States. Eugenics was a discipline, if you will, that was developed as a response to social welfare, or what they called counter selection. Charity, social welfare, taking care of the downtrodden, the ill, and the poor was something that eugenics sought to get rid of because they felt it would actually allow weak elements to prosper. Eugenics was also a discipline that tried to promote scientific study of race. And I looked at who came into the room today, and most of you are old enough to know that until the 1970s, there was a belief in our school system, scientifically, that there were 3 basic races of humans. That's been dismissed because we can find no genetic basis to support the concept of a human that is one racial group or another. With 99% homogeneity in their DNA, it's very hard to prove that an Asian is fundamentally different from an African, or this very funny expression, Caucasian. If you come to see me, you'll never hear me use the word Caucasian. To me, it means somebody from the Caucasus. So if one of you came to see me as a patient, I would call you a European, because that's what you ethnically are most likely. But there was an attempt to scientifically study the race or subspecies of humans, and this went on for many, many, many years. And some of the diseases that were used by the eugenics crowd as proof of racial inferiority are written here on the slide. Hemoglobinopathies such as sickle cell disease in African Americans, Arabs, and a few others. Thalassemia in Greeks, Italians, Africans, Southeast Asian. They were all used to show that these people were genetically inferior. Storage diseases like the Jews have, like Gaucher's, was used to demonstrate that the Jews are genetically inferior. And this also led to racial anthropology and study of body types to try to detect who has African blood, who has Asian blood, who is a Jew. I find everybody's interest in getting their genetic profiles evaluated to find out where their heritage is from. I find that very funny. That's what people are doing today because they don't know how well vetted or proven it is and what kind of large population studies they've done to demonstrate whether these things are true. It's a more sophisticated way of measuring your head circumference to determine what your ethnicity is or the shape of your nose, but it's a similar idea. Now, proposed in the 1990s when Yehuda Bauer was sitting in my parents' house was that this was not isolated, that actually what was going on in medicine and science informed the progress of the Nazi genocide of the Jews, that racial theory and politics contributed to legislation. The legislation led to courts of racial hygiene, which I think you might remember from the fictionalized movie, A Judgment at Nuremberg, that led to concentration in ghettos, a form of quarantine, and then finally extermination of inferiors. Now, this is a theory. It's a historical theory. There is no document that will show you that the direction of these arrows is correct. But I'll provide you with some circumstantial evidence that would be very convincing. When the Nazis assumed power, I do like to remind medical students, especially whose knowledge of history is very weak, that the most violent and horrific societies of modern times were generally democratically elected, that a benevolent monarchy such as the Ottomans or the Austrians were much better at preserving the safety and sanctity of their ethnic minorities because there were so many. And the post-World War I disaster, as Churchill called it, the disaster that was called the Versailles Treaty, created these small countries that could democratically elect demagogues. Now, Hitler did not win a plurality in 1932, but he was in the best position to form a government because he won many votes. And he was asked by the democratically elected president of Germany, Hindenburg, to form a government. And as you know, he did in 1933. And within a few months, the German parliament, the Reichstag, was burned down. And that was the end of the democratic experiment in United Germany until 1990. So in 1933, Hitler assumed power. Within 2 years, a blood protection law was passed that was called the Nuremberg laws. I think everybody on this phone call or this Zoom should know it. If you don't, you got to. Nuremberg laws were the first mass legislation based on concepts of genetic health. And the idea was to develop racial legislation similar to what we had in the United States, but take it 10 steps further. And really ensure that the biology of the folk would be protected by genetic counseling. They also established clinical studies on the racial specificity of disease, which often was attributed to racial mixing. I'm sure some of you know from the first great American musical Showboat that it's all about racial mixing, miscegenation. In the United States, there were anti-miscegenation laws. A black and a white couldn't marry and have children. So in 1935, such laws were proposed and passed in Germany. By then, there were many mixed children in Germany because many African immigrants after World War I moved into Germany and married white women, and they were subjected to horrendous experimentation. Now, the observations that mixing contributed to sickness were really contradicted by many scientific studies, but those were put aside because there was what we like to call in medicine, there was this bias, either an availability heuristic or some kind of heuristic that made people avoid things that didn't make sense and stick with the plausible. And to them, the plausible was that you were what you inherited in your genes. The Nuremberg Code included sterilization and anti-miscegenation laws. It set up German health councils and courts, again, modeled to some degree after the Americans, but taken 10 steps further. These were naturally gender dominated, only run by men, and over time evolved and expanded their role. And the way that they expanded their role, the first major way, came within about 3 or 4 years of the establishment of the Nuremberg Code, and that was with the euthanasia program. The euthanasia program was developed almost serendipitously. As Robert Proctor, an American historian, writes, a father of a profoundly mentally retarded child wrote to Adolf Hitler, begging him to do something about his son. He believed that his son was a burden to the state, that taking care of the son was a burden to the people, and isn't there something that the medical community could do? And Hitler didn't do anything with this except pass the letter on to the president of the German Medical Society, a man named Leonardo Conti. And that got the ball rolling. Many papers were published between 1935 and 1940 about lives not worth living, duty to the healthy, mercy killing, and there began the medicalization of racial policy that I would propose led to medicalization of anti-Semitism. Just to finish this topic for you, to give you again some circumstantial information that might or might not be useful for the way that I lay out this program. The first individuals who were euthanized were not Jews. They were German mentally retarded kids. And the program was named after the large mental hospital in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse number 4. It was called the T4 program. I hope if you visited Berlin, you've walked on that street. It's a grand street leading from east to west, past the zoo. And there, the first severely and profoundly mentally retarded children were anesthetized to death. They were given lethal injections of morphine. A euphemistic letter was written to the family that the child had died under some sort of circumstances they didn't know, and that was it. But morphine was expensive, hard to come by. Needles were hard to come by. Syringes, hypodermics was also not very easy to come by. And so over time, the program developed, and by 1939 or so consisted of vans in which these kids would be placed, in which the exhaust from the van was directed back into the cabin, and they were gassed to death. This program continued for a while, about 18 months, maybe 2 years, and the public found out. And the public, there was an outcry from religious leaders and from the public, and the program ostensibly stopped. So even in the totalitarian regime that was Hitler's Nazi Germany, enough public opinion could stop an overt program. But most likely some element of this program continued, but on a much lower scale. Jewish prisoners were gassed a little later, and I'll show you the timeline shortly. Now, in the 1990s, there was a pressing need by American historians and German historians to figure out, why did doctors participate in this? This was sort of the entry question that Yehuda Bauer proposed to me. You know, why are you feeling so noble being a doctor? Look at what doctors have done. And of course, there is no one answer. By then, it was 45 years or more since the war had passed. Many of the doctors were gone. Some lived. You can watch their testimonies on YouTube. Many of them were interviewed and spoke quite freely. And there were a variety of reasons, as you could imagine. Some were political, some financial, some were just sadistic people. Some did it for some pseudo-scientific purpose to try to discover what genetic forces were at play in different race. But the big point that I like to bring up to medical students is that physicians participated, but almost never under force or by demand of superiors. If we were, again, allowed a Socratic method in public, I would ask you, was there any profession in Germany where you had to be a Nazi Party member? And the answer is yes. The only profession was teaching. You were not required to be a Nazi Party member if you were a lawyer. You were not required to be a Nazi Party member if you were in the military. You were not required to be a Nazi Party member if you were a physician. Only if you were a teacher were you required to join the party. Otherwise, it was entirely voluntary. So let's see how the voluntary thing worked. A little bit of context. Of 50,000 physicians in Germany, 13% were Jews. But as soon as Austria was absorbed in March 1938, after the Anschluss, in Berlin and Vienna, many, many doctors were Jewish. And I always explain it to the kids. I haven't yet been cited, but you never know in this environment. Why were there so many Jewish docs? Well, it's the same reason that we have so many Asian medical students today, because they were the second generation that were liberated. The Asians, they came here as immigrants and ran stores and so on. They wanted their kids to be in a solid, internationally recognized profession. Likewise, the Jews. By 1920s, their parents had been successful since the 1880s or 90s, maybe even a little longer. Some of them had been ennobled, but they wanted their kids to have a profession that had international cachet and not dependent on language. My grandfather chose to become an attorney. It was a terrible decision. The family was safe in Switzerland. He brought them back after Chamberlain and Hitler signed the Munich Agreement. He said, how are you an attorney if you don't speak the language of the law? It's a terrible decision. Medicine has no such constraint. Jews were very active in basic and clinical sciences, but Jews were considered politically unreliable by the far right. Now in Italy, many of the Jews were in the right wing and supported Mussolini. But in Germany and Austria, they were usually on the left of the political spectrum. The last bullet is the one that's most damning. By early 1933, when Hitler assumed power, of the 50,000 physicians in Germany, only 2,800 were Nazi Party members. But in less than a year, 11,000 had joined. And as I like to point out to my medical students, they were all young. If you were over 60 and a doctor, your likelihood of joining the party was very, very low. If you were 40 or under, your likelihood of joining the party was extremely high. The youth took to this like, there is no simile that I can create for you. This was a youth movement to join the Nazi Party. The Nazi Physician League had 50% of their members under the age of 40. Now, was this professional opportunism because there were Jewish practices and Jewish positions that could be filled? Was this for financial gain? Did they really believe the science? Was it all of the above? Probably was all of the above. Now, why did this not happen in the United States? And one of the students asked me this last week when I gave this talk. I give this talk once a year. And he was correct for his age. He said, well, in the last administration, many people were coming on the far right. Do you think that that would have persuaded medicine to follow a similar thing in the United States? And I said, well, there's a big difference in the United States. The medical profession in the United States is not unified. It is not vertical. I don't know who the president of the American Medical Association is. And if you told me, I would say, well, he doesn't speak for me. I don't know. Or she doesn't speak for me. The doctors in this country have been furiously independent and iconoclastic. Now, could that change? Of course, that could change. But in Europe, even today, most medical professionals are not iconoclastic. They're hired by the state, and they show due deference to Herr Professor, or the professor's professor, or the Führer, the leader professor. And so it is very vertical. And some historians think that that contributed to the movement, but it became a big Nazi medical community. Now, was there resistance? Yeah, there was. Precious little, but there was. There was an association of social physicians that should more probably read socialists. They numbered 1,500 at their max of 50,000 doctors. So by the end of 1933, they were, silenced. There were some international protest groups, particularly in England, and there was, right across the border, an association of Czechoslovak social democrat physicians. You can imagine that they were put on the list. And in March 1939, when the Nazis occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, the part that Britain and France had not given them, they were sent off. By the way, Gentiles were sent off in occupied Czechoslovakia if they resisted, but a Jew married to a Gentile might not be sent off. We had a relative that lived the war very finely. Her Gentile husband was sent to labor camp. So, there were no rules. The rules were very arbitrary in certain areas, and whoever was the leader in the area, that's how it went. But there wasn't a lot of resistance. But there probably was a lot of silent protest and covert resistance, because most survivors could tell you some story. Certainly my father told some story about how his mother survived and overcame typhus because of the physicians in the Lodz ghetto, and they were not all Jews. That probably was the maximum resistance that people could offer. Now, are you able to see this slide, the statistics? This is for our statisticians here. I read this in the British Journal of Medicine, which was in the UCLA library. I haven't been in the UCLA library for 16 months. I don't think anybody has, but they have their historic journals, and they don't even know sometimes that they're historic. They've just been collecting them since time immemorial. Some German physicians published a paper looking at 3 diseases: typhoid fever, which is salmonella, tuberculosis, which is Mycobacterium tuberculum, and typhus, which has nothing to do with typhoid. It is a tick-borne or louse-borne rickettsial bacterial infection. Before 1939, in Lodz, the second biggest city in Poland, renamed Lippmannstadt when the Germans occupied it, there was no typhoid and no typhus before 1939, and TB contributed to 14 deaths per 100,000. The ghetto was established in 1941, about, to quarantine Jews who were racially inferior and to put them in a quarantined, caged environment. And suddenly, by then, the incidence of typhoid, tuberculosis, and typhus dramatically increased. And that grandmother of mine who survived typhus succumbed to typhoid. To tuberculosis, excuse me. She succumbed to tuberculosis. So the Nazis used this to explain that when you isolated the Jews and they didn't mingle with the population, you could see their inherent propensity to disease that you would not have been able to observe outside the laboratory setting of a ghetto. Now, many letters were written to the editor. This was already in the wartime, 1941, stating that, but these are unrealistic statistics. In my family, there were 9 people to a single room. They lived on 600 to 800 calories a day. They worked 7 days a week. So how could you say that the genes contributed to this death rate? Didn't the environment contribute to the death rate? It was the nature-nurture debate all over again in this pseudo-scientific bubble called a ghetto. Mass extermination began later, and this is the chronology of the initial exterminations beginning in 1939, 1940, 1941, the euthanasia of Jewish prisoners who had so-called incurable physical ailments, and then after the January 1942 Wannsee Conference, the planned extermination of racial inferiors in the final solution. With, again, improved scientific technology that allowed gassing instead of mass shooting or other means to eliminate these people. There were a variety of research studies that were conducted in concentration camp. The most infamous ones are the twin studies. We'll talk of some more. My wife knew a surviving twin that lived in Conejo Valley in Thousand Oaks area. Paradoxically, Mengele's twin experiments, where they both would be injected with live Plasmodium malaria, and one of them dissected alive and the other one allowed to live to see what would happen. Believe it or not, if you were a twin, your likelihood of being liberated by the Russians and survive was much greater than if you were a regular inmate, because of these crazy scientific experiments. And so you've seen the footage of the Russian liberation of Auschwitz, where a bunch of 3- and 4-year-olds, now our youngest survivors left, came and showed the numbers on their arms. And that's because they were often the subject of scientific experimentation, which killed many, but still the likelihood of survival better than the average person who came into the camp as a teenager or an adult. What were some of the implications of Nazi medical experimentation? Well, there were many. Of course, at Nuremberg, at the trials, not to be confused with the Nuremberg law, 10 physicians were sentenced to death by hanging. Many were put on trial, but a tiny fraction of those who participated. Of course, this was a violation of the patient-physician relationship, a violation of autonomy, a subordination of the patient to a so-called higher authority. This involved the abuse of medical skills and medical technology, and was murder that was disguised by medical technology. Of course, again, the opposite of autonomy. This was paternalism, abrogation of patient rights, repudiation of the concept of consent, repudiation of sanctity of life, and science and scholarship were used as political tools to support the concepts of eugenics. Now, although things this extreme did not happen in the United States, things on this spectrum occurred in the United States. And that, I think, is why so many people, particularly non-Europeans, are correctly reticent to participate in clinical trials, as important as it is. And I'm a clinical trialist, you know that. I run a unit of docs, and we have about 50 clinical trials, and I probably am the principal in 20 of them. And we accrue 60 patients a year to clinical trials. So this is my bread and butter, but I'm quite aware of people's well-founded skepticism, even if they don't know this history, about human experimentation and the doctor's personal needs for aggrandizement in pursuing this experimentation. Now, at the Nuremberg Trial, doctor's trial, which was concluded in 1947, several studies were brought out that were very prominent. Some of them were not done on Jews or other racial inferiors. The Dachau cold water immersion experiments were done, as some of you older folks will know, on American prisoners of war, as well as Brits and French. The freezing and hypobaric exposures were done on prisoners of war, Allied. These limb transplants before the concept of immunology were done on a collection of individuals, both considered racially inferior and those not. The perpetrators are just a few of them here listed. I want to point out that these were studies, in quotes, that were funded by competitive grant proposals. Mengel's experiments on twins went through scientific review and were funded. And his principal investigator was this man, Ottmann von Verschoor, who survived the war, went to prison, came back, died in an automobile accident in the late 1960s. So again, these were not hidden, they were known. Every few decades comes an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, our premier journal. There was one in 1945, one in 1990, there'll be another. Should any of the results of these experiments be published? Because they might, in a utilitarian way, help people. And the uniform answer is no. They can never be published for multiple reasons. The most important of which is that they would encourage the concept that not obtaining informed consent allows you to publish. The second major reason, of course, for those who still worship the utilitarian concept, they were never done in any controlled fashion. They were done in a ghoulish, sadistic fashion where hardly were two people subjected to the same merciless experimentation. What happened? What was the academic price of Nazi science? Well, of course, it was the death of faculty in German-speaking universities. Fortunately, not so many were truly killed, but there were many. In Germany, most of them were, as my father used to say, kind of lucky because they were dismissed early and they had several years to get out. And that was not true. In Austria, they had 18 months. In Czechoslovakia, they had 6 months. In Poland, they had 0 days. In Hungary, they had 0 days. But the ones in Germany were dismissed early. And they came to the US and to England, where they founded medicine that today is conducted entirely in the English language, as is science. So we were the great beneficiaries of this mass exodus, and there's a book on it. But there were other prices to be paid. Science as a political philosophy and medicine as a power authority, we suffer from that today. And finally, for about 60, maybe 65 years, there was a repudiation of biologic determinism in social sciences. You could never say that somebody inherited schizophrenia or criminality. Today, enough time has passed where people say, well, maybe there is some genetics going on here, that it's not entirely social. But for decades, you'd never get a paper published if you ever said anything like that. What was the post-war revisionism? Well, of course, the German textbooks were rewritten. But until about 20 years ago, there were specimens in Vienna at the University Medical School of human brain and spinal cord that had, we shall say, uncertain provenance. And when that came public in English language journals, those specimens disappeared from the hallways. However, the Pernkopf Atlas, which is the major atlas of neuroanatomy that every neurosurgeon owns, many of the anatomical pathways were derived from concentration camp victims. After the collaborators were freed from prison, they set up programs in human genetics, which finally, we started learning about DNA and protein, and we're still learning now to this day. But some of these collaborators were rehabilitated, actually. The implications for clinical research were great. They were discussed in the Helsinki Accords. They continued to be discussed in the International Program for Harmonization. There are very strict controls on clinical research with supervisorial bodies of several layers, as well there should be. And there is abiding mistrust from a skeptical patient population. And I will stop sharing and now give you a few minutes for questions.
Anybody have any questions? Don't you usually? Oh, go ahead, Marshall. Yeah.
Gary, there was an article in this morning's Times or yesterday morning's about the medical ethics of genetic testing of embryos to select, or they're trying to get people to select embryos to eliminate certain diseases. And there's a big controversy over these startup companies in Silicon Valley.
As well, there should be. That pales in comparison to CRISPR or CRISPR-Cas9's alterations of a genetic material that could be passed on for generations, or which, as you know, happened in that baby in China who had a gene altered or deleted to prevent HIV infection. And again, the idea was that by the investigator, well, but this is very good. This will create a girl who will pass on genes to her children who would be impervious to HIV. Well, what else is going to go wrong there? And does the end justify the means? There has been an artificial barrier. It is a wedge on a slippery slope. I don't mind saying it again, whatever anger it engenders, that we will not alter germ cells because of the implication of passing on altered genes that God didn't make to future generations. And believe me, that wedge is there only by mutual consent, and who knows how long it'll hold. The applications from this, this experience that I told you, reverberate.
So you don't think there's any situation where altering the genetic material to prevent some terrible disability would be justified?
I find it easier for, again, looking at our ethical principles, I find it easier for sanctity of life to violate the autonomy principle if you do it for the individual, but not for the entire, for all future generations. I can imagine that if you have a child in utero that has inherited 2 sickle cell genes, that you could alter the genetic code in utero of the fetus, or shortly after birth, to never turn off fetal hemoglobin production, and the child will never get sickle cell disease. What is much more troubling would be if you went into the parent's egg and deleted their carrier genes, because you don't know what else you're going to be deleting. And what's the limit? If you want to delete those genes, why don't you delete the genes that, I don't know, create kinky hair? What's the limit? There's no natural limit to it. Better to solve the disease than to alter the genes of future generations, because then you are carrying out racial hygiene. You just put a more scientific veneer on it.
Am I?
You can talk.
Yeah, I think the point I take from your presentation is that scientists are willing to do anything, and still are.
Sure, of course. Just like business people are willing to do nearly anything to make extra money.
But while here we have this, I'll say in the West, we have, I don't know about the Middle East or the East, but I know in the West there's a pretty strong effort to introduce an ethical element to what scientists will and won't do. But that really doesn't exist in the East, or I really don't understand what's in Russia anymore. And so,
or in China, you should definitely ask.
I say the East, but I meant specifically Russia and China and North Korea. I mean, that experimentation, biological warfare didn't exist at that time. Now it does. And so that kind of.
Well, it did. They just were no good at it.
They were bad at it, but
yeah.
With that kind of
World
ability.
War I, they tried biological warfare.
But you see, with the ability to have no ethic at all, no moral compunction about doing that type of thing, combined with this new ability, I mean, where are we in the world anymore? I really don't understand the level of to me, it strikes me as a very dangerous, a bad situation. It's not like nuclear warfare.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous situation. And, now the politics have settled down. If you find out that the COVID-19 was from the Wuhan lab, which certainly is very plausible, it shouldn't stretch credibility at all, credulity. I think you're going to have a lot of questions. The way we do it in the West, and that's all I know, is that we constrain it financially. So you can't open a study unless it goes through a scientific peer review committee that looks at the science, that goes through an ethics committee. And some of you are on we always have public members on the UCLA ethics committees. We have two, actually. They're called IRBs, Institutional Review Boards. State funding, federal funding, the protocol has to undergo extensive review. And so we've got oversight of people whose careers or career advance and finances are not dependent on this trial going forward. Now, doesn't mean it's foolproof, but it's helpful. So likewise, if you have a government-sponsored research in China that attempts to eliminate the Uyghurs or something like that, you got to find a way that they're going to be impoverished because of it, that there are going to be financial implications for supporting such trials. But you also have to know what's going on, and it won't be transparent. So you're right. You're muted. You're muted.
Do you remember how it felt in the 60s with nuclear proliferation, and what were we up against, and where was this going to end? And then it seemed to somehow get under control by the end of the 70s and the 80s. So I feel like this is round two of that with with scientists and doctors who will do this, and he also having this new ability to actually do it.
Right.
I really feel like but it's not really getting the same play as the nuclear contest had in the 60s and the 70s. I don't hear this is a very large news story.
Okay, so one at a time. Now you are the legatees. I confer this upon you, and now all of you who listen, you go and tell 30 people, and so it'll go. That's the only way, right? Education's the only way.
Any other questions?
I really do kind of feel seriously that the people who didn't survive the Holocaust, you've seen the ones that survived, the people who did not survive, expect you who are listening to these stories to keep educating yourselves till the end of your lives and pass on those lessons. That's the biggest lesson of the Holocaust. It's not a one-liner. It's a multi-pronged thing, and we're old enough and close enough to have known them that we must pass it on, because everything that I told you guys, you knew most of it. But when I speak to 25-year-olds, they don't know any of it.
Right.
All right. Thank you all. If you want a fourth session, talk to Rabbi Nanis.
Okay, let me know. Thank you so much.
We do.
Okay, we'll set it up.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Have a nice evening. Thanks so much, Gary. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Too late. Too late.